I'm pleased and honored to open already the fourth event on United Nations Framework Classification for Resources and United Nations Resource Management System. This year it's entitled The Future of Sustainable Raw Materials Management in Europe. I would use also this first opportunity to thank the European Commission, DG GROW, the organizer, for setting up this condition for the session. We will start with introductory remarks, one video and address and two online speeches. And as we have quite intensive and fully packed session, without further ado, I would introduce first the video from Ms. Olga Algaerova, Executive Secretary of United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. So I believe that the video is ready.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm pleased to open the event on the future of sustainable raw materials management in Europe and the role of the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources and the United Nations Resource Management System. While unfortunately I cannot be with you in person today, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to present UNEC's vision. DG GROW, Eurogeosurveys and the Economic Commission for Europe enjoy a strong and excellent cooperation, and I'm grateful that we are partnering on this event during the EU Raw Materials Week. The UNEC region encompasses 56 countries spanning from North America, Europe, the CIS region, to Central and Western Asia. The region includes some of the largest producers and consumers of resources, and our membership manages a significant essential share of the world's financial and technological capacity. As an organization, UNEC promotes sustainable development and economic prosperity with dialogue, exchanges of best practices, negotiation of legal instruments, norms and standards, and technical cooperation. We meet at a time of significant challenge. Discussions leading up to COP26 highlighted the existential need to address climate change. If the world is to deliver on climate change and attain the objectives of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we must optimize our endowments of natural resources. That imperative is one of the critical objectives of our work. In essence, we seek to deliver on quality of life aspirations around the world. Attaining the objectives of the 2030 Agenda will require integrated solutions that deliver on the environmental, economic, and social dimensions. Governments and intergovernmental organizations, including the United Nations regional commissions, must play their role by cooperating and sharing best practices and our vast knowledge and experience. In this time of challenge, it is possible to find opportunities. The European Green Deal sets out a roadmap for making the EU's economy sustainable by turning climate and environmental challenges into opportunities across all policy areas and making the needed transitions just and inclusive for all. Managing our natural resources sustainably has never been more pressing. We need to move towards a circular economy paradigm through pragmatic policies and workable solutions. UNEC has embarked on a new nexus vision for sustainable management of resources that emphasizes integrated solutions leading to zero harm, zero waste, and circular economy. Most of you are familiar with the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources, or UNFC, that UNEC has developed over many years with the support of a global network of experts. Unfc is a tool for classifying and reporting natural resources. The United Nations Resource Management System, or UNRMS, that is under development, provides a set of standards for integrated and sustainable management of resources. UNRMS is a dynamic resource management system based on principles that can help countries meet their obligations and commitments under the 2030 Agenda. UNFC and UNRMS both support the goals of the European Green Deal. UNFC, through financial reporting integrated with environmental and social governance, and UNRMS by providing the principles, standards, guidelines, and best practices for the responsible development of resources. Availability of critical raw materials is an important factor for the green transitions, including energy and mobility. And I'm pleased to note that the European Commission has successfully tested the application of UNFC to integrate information on critical raw materials, including battery raw materials. Earlier this year, the UN Secretary General issued a policy brief on transforming the extractive industries for sustainable development. The global call for action in the brief includes the 5-point agenda put forward by UNECE. The 5 points include considerations for a social contract on natural resources, a sustainable financing taxonomy, sustainable resource management using UNFC and UNRMS, transparency and traceability of the minerals value chain, and lastly, comprehensive strategic environmental assessments. I wish to thank the European Commission and in particular DG GROW for the support and assistance in our activities related to UNFC and UNRMS. These activities include development, maintenance, and notably the implementation of UNFC and UNRMS and its updates in Europe through our cooperation agreement. I'm hopeful that this model of cooperation would serve for future cooperation, not only in the area of raw materials, but also in other areas of mutual interest. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by wishing you a successful session and deliberations. I really look forward to learning the outcomes and to continuing the fruitful cooperation between UNECE and the European Commission and all our partners represented here today. Thank you.
Thank you. We would have our first online speaker giving the welcome address, Mr. Joaquim Nunes de Almeida, the Director of Ecosystem for Mobility and Energy Intensive Industries. I believe he would be online already.
Yeah, I'm here.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my real pleasure to welcome you together with our colleagues from UNECE and from Eurogeosurveys in today's event labeled The Future of Sustainable Raw Materials Management in Europe. This is a great opportunity to discuss the sustainable and secure supply of raw materials for the green and digital transition and successful recovery of our industry from the COVID-19 pandemic. Recent supply disruptions in semiconductors, magnesium, permanent magnets have shown us danger of the EU being excessively dependent on components and materials from highly concentrated sources of supply. And we need to strengthen our ecosystems to improve resilience and reduce dependencies. The industrial strategy update that we adopted on the 5th of May contains an analysis of these strategic dependencies. raw materials is one of the areas where we urgently need to increase our EU resilience. This requires action on 3 strategic fronts. We must increase circularity, thus the use of secondary raw materials, especially the critical raw materials, boost domestic sourcing of primary raw materials, and diversify supply through strategic partnerships with reliable, resource-rich third countries. Now, what concrete actions are we taking? We help the raw materials community to mobilize and connect with downstream industries and wider society. We have launched the European Innovation Partnership on Raw Materials, EIT Raw Materials, and the new ERMA, the European Raw Materials Alliance. Through Horizon Europe, our flagship research and innovation funding program, we continue investing in research and innovation projects. We program topics worth 300 million euro for the initial programming period 2021-2022. We invest to improve our knowledge base and intelligence on primary and secondary raw materials in Europe and harmonize data under the UN Framework Classification for Resources. We also invest to improve the efficiency, the safety, and the environmental performance of the raw materials industry, including transforming the extractive waste problem into a resource recovery opportunity. Production of non-energy raw materials is, however, a competence of the EU member states. We have encouraged our member states to use the recovery funds to support decarbonization of extraction industries and at the same time invest in the development of viable, sustainable critical raw materials projects, both for primary and secondary raw materials. Sustainable mining is about duly taking into account social, economic governance and environmental aspects aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to dialogue with the public on the conditions at which sustainable raw materials extraction, processing and recycling takes place in Europe. One of the inputs to this dialogue is the EU Principles for Sustainable Raw Materials that we developed together with member states, industry, trade unions, NGOs, and other stakeholders. These voluntary principles for sustainable raw materials in Europe build on the extensive EU acquis and address: first, human rights, engagement with communities of interest, employment, health, and safety. Second, business integrity, transparency, and wider economic contribution. Third, environmental management and impact mitigation. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to stress that we will stay committed to support the development of the UN resource management system and the speedy deployment of the UN framework classification for resources in Europe. They can help us with the management and development of resources, including critical raw materials and the potential of secondary raw materials. Quality data and information on the social, environmental, economic viability, technological feasibility, and risks associated with the production of raw materials are essential for future sustainable development of raw materials in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your clear three-point message, and I hope you can stay with us in throughout this session. And now I would introduce the third welcome speech from Ralf Watzel, the president of German Geological Survey and the president of Eurogeosurveys. I believe we would have him online. If yes, yes. Ralf, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you hear me well. Honorable representatives of UNECE, Honorable Director Núñez de Almeida, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to welcome you here on behalf of Eurogeosurveys as a co-organizer. Raw materials have always been the basis of technical development and welfare since the beginning of civilization. We have seen a remarkable globalization of production chains and markets since the 1990s, and I would say that has weakened our European perception of the value of raw materials to a certain extent. Times have changed. Entering the 21st century, we directly face serious challenges on the European and on the global scale. And I mean steady global population growth, the need to secure the means of livelihood and welfare for more than 7 billion people on the globe, mitigation of the climate change and all the environmental and societal challenges coming along with that, and from the European perspective, the rise of China. These developments increase the need for minerals, and they increase especially the need for new minerals. And what I'm talking about is raw materials for the technologies of the future to cope with these challenges. And I want to say the members of the European community are well advised to join their knowledge, their experiences, and their passion. Traditional mining never was the business of a single person. And mining of raw materials for future technologies, or even better, the sustainable raw material management in Europe, just as much. Europe suffers from the pandemic since spring 2020, and Europe suffers from raw material shortages since spring 2021. For the first time since the oil crisis in 1973, Europe faces not only soaring prices, but also production declines in industry due to lacking imported raw materials and refinery products. And Director Núñez de Almeida mentioned the keywords magnesium, silicon, and rare earth elements are in the headlines of the newspapers in these days. And the question is, what will the situation in terms of lithium, cobalt, graphite, and nickel supply look like in the near future? My answer is, let your fantasy work. Mining and recycling, both at home, whenever and wherever sustainably possible, support the economic independence of Europe. So what kind of domestic deposits can we rely on? The answer to this question is a kind of challenge, even when collecting the basic data. And why is it so? European nations have developed their individual systems of description and appraisal of raw materials since the beginning of the first industrial revolution. And today it is hard to put the detailed national pieces together and to create a unified pan-European picture for better decision-making. It is hard, but it is worth. We are on track, but there is still a way to go. Ladies and gentlemen, EGS has a clear focus on data harmonization, and not just in relation to critical minerals, but also across the board to support EU decision-making. And this is the point where the UNFC and the UNRMS come in and are valuable. EGS has a unique position of having a long-standing expert network, of having access to important national knowledge and data sets to build the pan-European data sets required. A unique position of incorporating UNFC into past, present, and planned future projects. Having existing UNFC practitioners within EGS with close ties to UNECE, and having a strategic commitment to data harmonization as a basis for a future geological service for Europe to support EU policy initiatives, particularly in the case in regard to critical raw materials. Ladies and gentlemen, EGS represents the power of 38 geological survey organizations, 10,000 plus workforce, 1,800 plus peer-reviewed scientific publications annually, and 450 plus specialists in expert group and task forces. Let us keep this force at joint work. EGS stays committed. EGS Secretary General, Ms. Julie Hollis, will go into a bit more detail in her talk in the first session. And fortunately, some of the panel members in the second session will be significantly more specific about the outcomes and implication of specific projects, such as Mintel4EU, for example. My message is, enjoy the sessions, take your take-home messages, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the encouraging words, how the future action could be implemented through the large community of experts. Before starting the second session, entitled Toward Unified Management of Raw Material Resources in Europe and Beyond, let me point out also the possibility for the audience here, but the audience online in particular, to comment and to ask questions through the slido.com. You would have up there also the hashtag where you can join the discussion and ask question. The next thing, I would also alert you that in spite or because of having the hybrid meeting, we should keep in mind all the COVID-19 preventive measures. Why I'm telling you this, why I'm putting this extra stress, it's because our first speaker, in spite that he was fully vaccinated twice, he got the COVID in the past days, and he does not feel sufficiently well to give speech online. So we would have, instead of him, Mr. Harry Tulsidas, the technical lead of UNFC and UNRMS, step in. And Scott, if you are with us, we all wish you a fast recovery. Harry, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Scott Foster was supposed to have spoken to you today morning, but he sends his deepest regret for not being with you due to his health condition. So please accept his deepest apologies for not coming before you in person or through online. So I'm Hari Tulsidas, technical lead on UNFC and UNRMS at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And I will give you a very fast run through the two standards, UNFC and UNRMS, which we are developing, and how we are making it work for the European Union, especially in the context of the European Green Deal. We know that resource industries, especially mining industries, are always known as extractive industries, industries which take out wealth from the planet Earth and then leave only problems behind. This is a common perception which people have around the world. We have an exponentially increasing material footprint due to the all-around development that is going around in the world. That means that resources which are easily accessible are getting depleted, so we have to go deeper and mine less grade material. That means you have to mine more, you have producing more tailings, mining waste, etc. You are increasing the carbon footprint, water use, you have other environmental issues which are related with the mining, and this all leads to social conflicts. So this industry is called a drain industry, but what UNEC would like to see through the two standards which we have implementing throughout the world is to build a new story for this industry, which has been called drain industry so far. So what we are hinging on is the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, which says that we should have integrated and indivisible sustainable development, combining, harmonizing all sectors of the economy and society, which means we have to move away from the short-term planning and management of resources to something longer in term, so that we can take both primary and secondary materials into one basket and then show that we can actually go on with the development of the society in full-fledged manner without coupling it with an increased resource use. We can really decouple the resource use and the development. We can put materials into service of the society as long as possible through recycling and combining the use of primary and secondary materials. So what in essence that will mean that the present generation can have whatever quality of life they aspire for without compromising what future generation will have to do with in this world in future. So UNFC, which has been updated in 2019 to take care of the Sustainable Development Goals, which was inaugurated in 2015, it is applicable across resources and countries globally. It applies not only to minerals, but anthropogenic resources, groundwater, petroleum, and other resources, renewable energy, in one single framework, which is three-dimensional, as it is shown here, looking at the environmental, social, and economic axis, looking at the technical feasibility, and the degree of confidence. This is a tool for planning under decentralized approach for the governments, and this is where we think it comes really useful. But it also helps different stakeholders to work together. The national resource management means you have to work with the industry, financial sector, and national institutions like Geological Surveys. We bring together all the stakeholders into one framework, talking a common language, and a standardized manner to share the information. So how we are implementing UNFC presently is through the national accounts under the Environmental Social Accounting System, or SEA, or the national statistics, which gets all this data in a harmonized manner. And we are also looking into establishing a number of international centers of excellence in sustainable resource management, covering all resources so that one framework, one platform will be available for all stakeholders to come together and talk in a common language, integrating mining, energy, food production, water conservation, all together into one framework. Once we have the information available in UNFC, based on as I've said, the three axes of social, economic, environmental, and economics, technical feasibility, and confidence in the estimates, we can then think what next we can do with these resources, how we can progress with these resources. And this is where United Nations Resource Management System, or UNRMS, will become helpful. It is a framework for sustainable resource to be produced and used. It helps integrated and sustainable and adaptive development of resources. It meets specific governmental requirements for supporting and mediating supply and value chains of natural resources. And it includes principle-based toolkit to serve different needs of the stakeholders. So what we heard in the welcome addresses on supply chain issues, on getting some of the critical materials like magnesium, silicon, or rare earths, we can have advanced planning under UNRMS to make sure that you don't get surprises when pandemics happen or geopolitical events happen, and you are always ready to look for alternatives, because with UNRMS, you have everything under your fingertips. You know where materials are there and how we can progress in a sustainable manner with them. So with UNFC and UNRMS, we are aligning the whole mining industry, the raw material supply system to 2030 agenda. We are looking to improve the financial resilience through reporting using UNFC so that the companies can have business process innovation, the financial sector can have new approaches to ESG-focused funding. We think that through this, we can derive good social, environmental, and economic outcomes. Not just economic outcomes, but social and environmental outcomes, good. And we will have the right social contract on natural resources using this integrated approach. And this, as is shown in this slide, it is a system that is widely applicable to all the resources, renewable energies, groundwater, minerals, and injection projects for geological storage of CO2, etc. So this is where we think a new beginning will be made. The highest body in the UN, the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, has approved this for international use or worldwide use, and many member states of the UN are already starting to apply it. In May this year, the Secretary General of United Nations has brought out a very seminal paper, policy paper, called Transforming Extractive Industries for Sustainable Development, and I welcome all of you to download this paper and read it. It calls for action, includes implementation of UNFC and UNRMS in a global manner. And this is going to be an action platform going forward in making sure that mining industry is not seen as a drain industry, but as a new industry which is supporting sustainable development across the globe. We think that we will be able to achieve full implementation of UNFC across the world using the several international centers of excellence which we are planning, and which will be looking into various areas like infrastructure gaps, new business plans, international reporting standards, so that we can attract investments and achieve global collaboration. We are very much focused on supporting the European Union in fully implementing UNFC, and we are grateful for the support European Commission has given us in this regard. And we think that through this project, we will have some very visible gains in the coming months and years. UNFC and UNRMS implementation in EU member states will be fully supported by UNECE and its expert group on resource management. We have already started development on a new UNFC for Europe guidance document, which will provide much more detailed guidance to the stakeholders. We are looking at increasing an EU expert base on UNFC practitioners, and we hope to have it as a network in the coming days. We have already demonstrated the use of UNFC in getting handle on the battery raw materials and supporting the green energy transition in Europe. Before I stop, I just invite your attention to the next UNECE event on UNFC and UNRMS, which will be the UNECE Resource Management Week 2022, which will be held from 25 to 29 April next year, Geneva and online. And this session, this week, will have a full one-day special workshop on UNFC for Europe, which will discuss various case studies which are under progress. So in conclusion, integrated and sustainable management of natural resources is critical. We need a harmonized reporting of all natural resources under a single framework, which is what UNFC is trying to achieve. We want to make resources to be managed as a public good in achieving SDGs, which will be the key focus of UNRMS. And with UNFC and UNRMS, we think that the right information and tools to manage natural resources will be available for the 21st century. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. Thank you. We are a bit late on time, so the next speaker, which does not need any introduction, because we all know him very well. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and please pass on my best wishes to Scott for a full and speedy recovery. I'm not going to repeat many of the things you've heard in a series of events already, and also from my director a few minutes ago. So we have a policy context, which is expressed on this slide, and you've got all the things we've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years, but we're currently preparing for even more. In January or February next year, we will come forward with our updated assessment of strategic dependencies and the actions that we intend to take in that area, including in the area of critical raw materials. You've heard about our criticality assessment already multiple times this week, so I will not linger on this one. And I'm sure you've heard also the 10 actions that we included in our critical raw materials action plan from September 2020. We're using industrial alliances as an important vehicle for getting things done on the ground. The key challenges being threefold. Firstly, to bring together businesses and non-industrial stakeholders around a particular problem area. Secondly, to identify the investments that are needed in that particular area. We always adopt a value chain approach from the beginning to the very end, and a very strong circularity dimension. And lastly, the job of the members of alliances is to identify barriers that they can then refer to the public policy level for them to decide what to do. We are currently working on the taxonomy for sustainable financing. Already a first set of criteria are about to be finished and signed off on climate mitigation and adaptation. And that covers many of the biggest emitting sectors like steel, cement, chemicals, and so forth. We have actually started a track to develop criteria for the raw materials value chain. This was action 2 in the critical raw materials action plan, and that work is frankly stuck. So we're currently discussing with the chairman of the Sustainable Financing Platform how to reset, relaunch this work to come to some useful results in the coming next year, basically. There we are. This is quite interesting. So you've heard that we are spending 300 million in 2021, 2022 under Horizon Europe. What doesn't come out quite so clearly is that we are integrating the UN framework classification in projects. So the first project is about the primary sourcing of primary raw materials, and we're mapping in a domestic and third country primary raw materials using Unfc, and also we're doing the same thing when we're mapping the supply or the potential supply of secondary raw materials. And of course this is factored into the work we're doing with the CSA for the European Geological Surveys. And the results of this work is that we're developing a database of critical raw material projects in Europe, which we're working on through the Raw Materials Supply Group, and we're validating the data with member states. And this is showing us the maturity of projects which will help us then to deliver our political goals of identifying projects which can be accelerated and invested in to deliver our political objectives. And we're going to produce a web-based application of this before long. We're also working quite a lot on Earth observation using Copernicus And this is also helping to identify resources, manage resources, and keep an eye on post-mining activities. We have a lot of strategic partnerships under development. You've heard about this several times this week already. And we're systematically integrating UNFC as the common language for identifying the resources and understanding how we can best invest in projects that represent the best of balance. So with Canada, Ukraine already in place. We're having the conference on Latin America next week, and we hope to launch partnerships with a pilot set of African countries next year. You've heard also that we've come forward with EU principles for sustainable raw materials. We hope this will help improve the narrative and understanding of how we want to do things in Europe. And I'm going to wrap up with a couple of key messages which I think are important. Firstly, we in the European Commission are very strong supporters of the work that you're doing in the UNECE on the framework classification and the resource management system. We see increasingly that there's an understanding that the energy transition is integrally linked to the availability of sustainable raw materials. The IEA, for example, is working very intensively on this interconnection, and that's obviously part of your core business at the ECE. Second message is that we are working with our European Raw Materials Alliance on an investment pipeline, and we expect IRMA to present projects, its investment cases, using the UN framework classification, so we can understand not only that projects are technically mature, but they are financially ready to be invested in, and they tick all the right boxes in terms of environment, social, and governance. We need that balance in order to be able to assess which projects the European Commission can give its political support to, and minimize the risks which are always attached to raw material related projects. We have some very good practice in the European member states, and I think we'll hear about this a little bit later. So with that, I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for your very clear presentation. I think that messages were very well taken. The next speaker would be, it is Erika Ingvald, the member of Swedish Geological Survey, and she will give us the national perspective on UNFC and UNRMS. So I hope that Erika is with us.
I'm here.
Great.
So I can hear myself speaking. So thank you, Slavko, and also send my regards to everyone actually that has been hit by COVID. So ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, thanks for inviting me to talk today about how we're working with UNFC and UNRMS at the Swedish Survey. It's a pleasure to be in this context with this audience and fellow speakers. I wish I could have been there in person, but the pandemic put a stop to that, so I look forward to next year instead to meet you all. So what do we do at the survey? What got us interested in UNFC to begin with was the simplicity in which the classification is visualized, where you can use 3 numbers to inform policymakers and decision makers about the status of a project. It also helped that Sigurd Heiberg led the way to a Nordic collaboration, where we developed guidance on how to apply UNFC in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. That work gave us an understanding on the strength of the system, but it also opened our eyes to the usefulness of having a region guidance, because the legislation varies in different countries. And at that time, it was especially useful coupled to the e-axis that has later on been developed much more. But this work was so interesting to our government that they gave us a commission to actually do this and do it together with the Swedish EPA. But we got that commission when most of the work was already done, but we produced a separate report for that with the EPA and valuable input from them. After that, we also developed case studies for limestone and aggregates with Finland and Norway. And we also participated in some geo-area projects. Someone mentioned Minted for EU here. And we took responsibility on doing case studies on RE, both on primary and secondary resources. We have world-class deposits here on RE, so we thought it would be of interest to actually develop that. And it was, this job was useful in so many ways, but one of them was the peer review that was made by GTK that showed us that having someone from another country looking into your work is actually very useful, because you get blind for what you have in your own country because you know it so well, so you don't describe it in the text. So thank you to GTK for that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the REs later on, but we also wanted to be involved. We also want to be involved with the coming CSA, where UNFC is an important component on a European level. As a survey, we have most use for UNFC in the context of primary and secondary raw materials. And we have decided to classify all new areas of national interest for raw materials that we demark. But for the other parts, for sustainable renewable energy and so on, we see that other agencies and other organizations will have use for this. So we invited authorities, companies, and researchers to a Swedish UNFC webinar in September, where we asked a number of experts from the international community to come and tell us about their work online. And we had over 200 participants. And it'll be interesting to follow up on that webinar. We've already got a lot of positive input from that. Also, in the context of circularity, and Sweden being a mining country for 2,400 years, we have a lot of mine waste. And the government has given us successive commissions to learn more about this waste and to map it and to see if it could be reused in some way. And in the latest commission that is running now, we also do a lot of heavy mapping, but added to that, we are going to build a database for UNFC classified secondary raw materials for the mine waste. And our plan is to make it work with primary resources as well. And we do this work together with the EPA. We've just got started, but Sigurd is helping us with this too. So I'm very positive. It's going to be very good, I think, in the end. So we're starting to work with the UNRMS. To get in this commission together with the EPA, we will also look into the legislation because it's not obvious how you can get access to something that's already mined in our legislation, and it's just laying there on the ground. So together with the EPA, we're looking into removing legal hinders, if there are any, to mine this waste. And such work is also being done by the industry, because I told you about the REMAP project that LKAB runs to mine their waste, where they have a lot of phosphor and REs. They use the falling waste, but they also want to use their old historical waste, and they need to be sure about how the legislation works so that they get permits to use it. When it comes to legal issues, it's not a secret nowadays that the permitting process is dysfunctional in Sweden. Just yesterday, the Swedish Confederation of Swedish Enterprise published a report saying that we have lost 50 billion kroner, that's 5 billion euros, over just a few years, and companies, due to this dysfunctional permitting process. We also see junior companies leaving Sweden now, and we see mining companies struggling. So things are going in the wrong direction. We also are self-inducing criticality for limestone due to this unclear legislation. And yes, it's just a big problem at the moment. So what we see is that the social and economic legs of sustainability are lost in favor of the environmental leg. And we all know that to have real sustainability, those three legs need to be balanced. And the Swedish government is really supporting, for instance, of the raw materials initiative and all the work that the Commission is doing in this direction. And also, we see that UNFC can be used to further illustrate the dysfunction and hopefully the journey towards a functional system. And I think that's necessary if we want to be a contributor to climate mitigation and to the 2030 agenda and to the European Green Deal. And there is a lot of work now going on with overhauling the permitting process. And in some way, I think UNFC will be very important, an important component in this work. So we see UNFC as a very important tool in the work of delivering sustainable raw materials and, for that matter, renewable energy and so on. So so far this has been it's been a steep learning curve. It's allowed us to communicate about raw materials in a way we couldn't do before. And I think we have some very interesting times ahead of us. And I think UNFC and UNRMS will be a very important component in that journey. And that journey is going to be done together with others. It's with other countries all over the world, hopefully. So I'm looking really much forward to that, almost as much as I look forward to traveling and meeting you in person. So I stop there and say thank you to all of you for listening.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you. And we noted that Sweden is doing the database on primary and secondary raw materials according to the UNFC, which is a step further. Let me introduce the next speaker, who is Julian Hilton. He is a chair of the SDG Delivery Working Group, and he will talk more specifically about the resource management system that is still under development. So, Julian, I have to again intervene because we are slightly late to be to the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Slavka. I'm looking at a clock, and the clock is counting down. And it reminds me, this clock isn't just about my 10 minutes, it's about the future of the planet. That clock is relentless, and that clock challenges us to find an equilibrium point, a place where we can agree between the short-term ambitions, and I'm thinking particularly of our leaders to stay in power, and our long-term obligation, which is to make sure the resources of the planet are still there for my grandchildren, their grandchildren, their grandchildren, and their grandchildren, and so on. And we have not resolved that. And COP26, in my experience of it, didn't take us much further either. So we have to make a choice. What is exciting to me, and my job for the UN in Geneva, is to help the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals in total, not just individual ones. So while we're focused on the resources piece, we're looking across the whole 17. That was very nicely summarized because we've moved from the business school model of environmental, social, and economic benefits, the triple bottom line, which was a very important transition step, but we now are talking about people, planet, and prosperity. And the point of prosperity, which is also about eliminating poverty, is that if the people on the planet manage the resources well, the prosperity will be shared. And if they don't, the exclusion issues and the fact that some people, individuals, are worth more than 20 or 30 countries will continue to widen that gulf. I will almost certainly not live to see the consequences of that gulf developing further, but it concerns me very much that it's widening, not shrinking. So that's why I'm interested in the UN resource management system, because I cannot see any way in which the Sustainable Development Goals can be delivered unless resource management is at the heart of that. And the resources, in my mind, that we have to focus on meet the critical needs of the 7, 8, 9 billion people on the planet. Those are food, energy, and water. And food is an emblem of the materials because what creates the food very much depends on the resources of water and energy and, of course, the nutrients that the soil provides. So as a counterpoint to our emphasis here in the European space on magnesium and lithium and rare earths, which are very small quantities but with a huge impact, I would also suggest that amongst other critical resources, the most important of all is people, their knowledge, their brains, their motivation, their ethical positions, but equally soils, because if we don't manage the soils correctly, we will not produce the food that people will depend on to live. That's why we arrived at the conclusion, and it was the previous Executive Secretary in Geneva who first articulated it in 2017, that resources have to be, at least in respect of meeting critical needs, they have to be treated as a public good. Public goods are non-competitive and they're non-exclusive. If we make water, if we make food, if we make energy exclusive and competitive, that means, as we know already, 1.5 to 2 billion people are excluded from most of those at various points. And we've just now been told, I think this week, that 20 million people are about to enter the food crisis piece of that in Afghanistan. So our record is not doing very well. But as Scott Foster's illness shows, there are brave people who expose themselves to serious danger, Scott being one. He was at COP and he caught COVID there. Why did he go to COP? He's about to retire. He had no reason. He could find plenty of excuses not to show up, but he didn't. That's what motivates me. But even worse, our dear friend, Professor Hassan Sayuti, died in the Ethiopian Airlines crash on his way to Nairobi to talk about resource management from Morocco, a key country in the African region. And he lost his life in the process, and it touches me even more because I might have been on that plane. I was originally planned to be on it. These are the costs that people are willing to pay to get this right. And I'm honored to be part of this meeting, and I enjoyed very much yesterday's, because I think there is an opportunity here for all of us to say, okay, if we're going to reset, why are we going to do that? Now, I think the drivers are ethical as well as anything else. And the most fundamental of those ethical principles is the movement from linear to circular. This is not just an economic model. This is a principle that acknowledges that the principles that drove the linear economy in the Industrial Revolution, beginning in my country, the United Kingdom, were colonialism, slavery, the exploitation of cheap labor. It meant the easy process of going to find resources in the ground, dig them up, take them to another country, and make the money there. And colonialism is not just one country to another. It goes on within the country. If you read the works of Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell, they tell you that the colonialism process goes on inside territories every bit as much as it does outside or between them. So the principles that I think drive UN resource management system are, how do we break that cycle, that vicious cycle, which is now broken? Now, what really impresses me is that on May 25th, which perhaps by no coincidence was the date on which George Floyd was also killed, the Secretary General of the United Nations published, after a long consultation process, the policy brief that says we have to change the paradigm of investment, we have to change the paradigm of the way in which we manage, and mandates the use of the resource management system worldwide. Now, we are part of that process. And to put it into action, three things have been happening. The first, we've looked at what makes this work. How do we get success stories out of this? There are three principles, and I've been working myself in a number of industries related to this food, energy, water triangle, of which perhaps food is the most interesting. In that case, we've been working with the fertilizer industry. The fertilizer industry has an international association, and the first new committee in its 100-year history was a sustainability committee. When I first started to work with them, you couldn't even say the word. Now they have a committee, and it is very popular. That has changed the attitudes in that critical industry to think about now reporting according to Sustainable Development Goals principles, but also showing three key principles. The change has to be led from the top, it has to be based on innovation, and it has to be based on partnerships. Secondly, we've seen the transition in the financial sector. We're now beginning to understand that environmental, social, governance issues are critical, but it was very much a leadership example when the move was taken to move the focus towards stakeholder capitalism, not the traditional model of only focusing on shareholder value. And the most striking version of that I've heard in a very long time was a board member of Unilever talking on a committee meeting of United Nations Economic Commission when they said, we are no longer talking about waste. We only extract resources from the ground or make new resources because we want to either retain their value forever or enhance them. That, I think, picks up a question that came from the audience yesterday, which is it time to move from the Waste Framework Directive to the Resource Management Directive? My view would be absolutely yes. But that means there has to be a new social contract, and that new social contract goes beyond the social license to operate to a contract that says everybody on the planet has this public good right of access to the critical needs and critical resources that they are all entitled to. And the third point, we're actually working on this and testing it. And we're testing it, and we have just done a very interesting food-based test program with students from Europe and from East Africa working on it with us. Ask, what do you, the rising generation of leaders of the future, want from such a resource management system, and how can you help build it so that you have a feeling of ownership and participation in that? And that process has yielded very good results, and industry is willing to come and participate in that process with us. So thank you very much for having listened to me, and for taking away from this, I hope, the point that each of us has a responsibility in that process to own part of the solution. That's why I think the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, I see Charlotte sitting here in front of us, that brought to you the traffic light system to manage traffic safely, brought seat belts to us. That's why the United Nations Economic Commission, working with the European Commission, is such a powerful place to have that conversation, because there is public good in safety, health, and well-being, and that now focuses from not killing ourselves on the road to preserving the resources, enhancing their value on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much for a very good reflection on why we are doing what we are. Last not the least, it's really my pleasure to introduce the EGS General Secretary, Julie Hollis. She will tell us about the EGS action related to UNFC and UNRMS. Julie.
Thank you, Slavko. A few years ago, I was doing some geological field work. I was making a geological map. But on the original broader scale map that I had at my disposal, which had been made in the early 1960s, I just couldn't understand why the rocks in one part of the map were mapped differently from some rocks in another part of the map that, to me, walking over the ground, looked just the same. Why were they different? Why had they been put on the map differently? And unfortunately, the two geologists who had made that original map were already dead, so I couldn't ask them. So this problem remained, and I wondered about what was going on. And eventually, I met an old prospector who, in his younger days as a geologist had worked together with these two geologists who'd made this original map. And when I asked him about this problem, he said, they couldn't agree on how to map the geology. They were always arguing about it. And so in the end, they agreed that they would work independently and they would put their separate maps onto the same final map. So there we go. The problem was resolved. The geology actually was the same, but it was seen through different eyes. The two geologists had thought that quite different features of the same rocks were important to put on the map, and as a result, we end up with this confusion. So this is just one example of the importance of seeing geology through the same eyes. Now, of course, we can't have the same one person make all the geological maps or make all of the databases that we need. And this is why the UNFC is so important. It's exactly that. It's a way of standardizing our approach in order to be able to see the geology through the same lens, not just in terms of the rocks and the mineral resources, but the environmental, the social, and the economic factors. And I don't think I need to preach to people here about the benefits of UNFC, but a key point that I do want to make is that not only is UNFC incorporated into many of the Eurogeosurveys projects, past and present, and planned for the future, but this philosophy of data harmonization and sharing is, I'm very glad to say, fundamental to the way that Eurogeosurveys operates. It is, in fact, a cornerstone of the Eurogeosurveys' strategic research and innovation agenda, and one of the three pillars of the EGS vision for a geological service for Europe, harmonizing and sharing pan-European geological data. And you only need to think about the nature of Eurogeosurveys itself to understand why that's the case. 38 different European geological surveys with different organizational structures, corporate cultures, languages, scientific approaches, histories, mandates, funding sources. We simply must operate in this way in order to deliver what we aim to, pan-European data that can actually be used for planning and decision-making on a continental scale, and for informing the wider public about Europe's subsurface resources. And of course, the European Geological Surveys are uniquely able to deliver that data, being as they are the national repositories of decades and, in many cases, more than a century of geoscience data collection for their countries. This is not new for Eurogeosurveys. Our members are well versed in developing such cooperations and systems and are unified in the recognition of the importance of those efforts. And for those who are not very familiar with Eurogeosurveys, the workhorses, if you like, of the organisation are the expert groups, which are drawn from experts from all of the members in specific thematic areas, which you can see here. Particularly relevant here today, of course, is mineral resources, but this is, of course, not the only expert group relevant to this discussion. For example, the Geological Mapping and Modelling Expert Group contributes to the foundational harmonised geological maps and data that are necessary to put mineral resources into context. Marine geology is relevant to subsea resources. Spatial information allows us to describe and present digital data and metadata and so on. If we look back a little, the Mineral Resources Expert Group of Eurogeosurveys has a long association with UNECE, and the UNFC is integral to projects undertaken by the Mineral Resources Expert Group. Originally, the Minerals for EU project was set up to provide European mineral resources data and deliver the European Minerals Yearbook through the European Minerals Information Network. From there, the Arama project brought together 16 partners to draw together resource and production volumes of raw materials, including secondary raw materials, to deliver these from a single source. And the Minerals Resource Expert Group has remained heavily occupied with mapping the interoperability of national datasets and UNFC through GeoERA projects, for example, through the Mintel for EU, Mineral Intelligence for Europe project, the purpose of which was to set up a permanent network of an information system for harmonisation of minerals data, update the electronic minerals yearbook and extend the coverage and quality of data in the minerals inventory. And through the FRAME project, forecasting and assessing Europe's strategic raw materials needs. Through these projects, the focus has continued to be on harmonisation, communication and interaction between data platforms in alignment with UNFC, and ultimately to integrate the data into a sustainable Eurogeosurveys governed European Geological Data Infrastructure, EGDI. This data structure is integral to EGS strategy and hosts the data and maps developed by the GeoERA projects and many other past and existing projects. And just last month, the second phase of the SCREEN project was launched and was a focus earlier in this Raw Materials Week to develop the expert network already set up in order to cover all raw materials screened in the Critical Raw Materials 2020 assessment. Publishing sector-oriented outlook reports, analysing future supply and demand of raw materials and supporting the Commission in policy making related to critical raw materials. The incorporation of UNFC and other data harmonisation and sharing approaches and techniques to all aspects of Eurogeosurveys project work is fundamental to the way that EGS operates and to our mission to develop a geological service for Europe that can provide on an ongoing basis into the future current, high-quality, accessible, harmonised geoscientific data that will support EU decision-making, not just in regard to critical minerals, but to the much broader spectrum of areas that geoscience data can comment on and the much broader range of industries that UNFC is applicable to, such as renewables and geological storage, and which will make a major contribution towards securing a sustainable supply of raw materials for Europe into the future. This harmonised approach embodied in Eurogeosurveys work is important. Even thinking about my small example earlier of getting the geological context right on a map that I was working on years ago, the recognition of how the map data should be harmonised resulted in an immediate recognition of how the geology should be understood more broadly on a regional scale, and from that basic geological mapping information, getting that right simply by viewing it through the same lens meant that mineral explorers were much more easily able to use the maps in exploration targeting. And that information led to a significant discovery and a lot more exploration investment. So it matters and it makes a difference. And I hope you will recognise the potential for the difference that can be made through the results of some of the GeoEra projects that will be discussed later in some more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. I believe we are already in the break time, so unfortunately we would skip the Q&A part. It's a bit too late, but all the comments that were sent in and all the comments that are still with you in the room are very welcomed and will be forwarded to the speakers. So let me just thank to the speakers, to the audience in the room and online, to the organizational team in the backstage. And of course, she'll stop here and stop standing between you and the coffee. I would just remind you that the second part of this event will start at 11:45. Thank you. Thank you very much.